Defeat did not arrive with the violence she had always imagined. There was no final explosion, no dramatic collapse that marked the end of everything she had known. Instead, it came as a thinning of noise, a slow withdrawal of certainty, a moment when the world seemed to exhale and leave her standing in the quiet. The war had moved past her position, both physically and morally, and what remained was a strange, suspended aftermath in which survival no longer felt like victory. It felt administrative, almost accidental. Roads once crowded with purpose were empty or filled with people moving without direction, their faces carrying the same expression she felt tightening her own, the awareness that history had made its decision, and it had not favored them. She had expected anger. She had expected shouting, spitting, perhaps worse. Years of propaganda and fear had trained her to believe that the enemy would arrive not simply as conquerors, but as punishers. Defeat, in her mind, meant exposure, being stripped not only of status but of humanity. She had rehearsed the posture of invisibility, the careful shrinking of the self that might reduce attention and therefore risk. To be ignored seemed the best outcome she could hope for. Ignorance, at least, carried the promise of survival. Around her, the signs of collapse were everywhere, though few spoke of them directly. Buildings stood intact yet hollow, as if emptied of meaning. Uniforms were still worn, but without pride, without the confident bearing that once made them symbols rather than fabric. Orders no longer arrived. When they did, they were fragmented, contradictory, stripped of authority. The machinery of war had not exploded, it had simply stopped, like a clock whose ticking one only notices when it ceases. She had been taught that endurance was loyalty, that silence was strength, that doubt was betrayal. Now, silence was unavoidable, but it carried none of the clarity she had been promised. It was a silence thick with unanswered questions. What did it mean to have held on until the end if the end itself dissolved without ceremony? What remained of sacrifice when the cause it served no longer existed in any tangible form? The physical exhaustion was familiar. It had been her companion for months, perhaps years. Hunger, cold, and the constant awareness of danger had become routine, folded into daily life until they felt less like suffering and more like background conditions of existence. What unsettled her now was the absence of direction. The war had given shape to time, dividing days into duties and nights into anxieties. Defeat erased that structure. Time stretched, shapeless and uncertain, filled with waiting that had no clear purpose. She found herself watching others closely, searching their movements for clues. Some clung to old habits with desperate precision, polishing boots that would never again march, straightening insignia that no longer held meaning. Others discarded everything at once, as if speed might erase responsibility. No approach seemed to offer relief. Everyone carried defeat differently, but no one escaped its weight. Her own expectations were shaped by stories whispered long before the war turned against them. Stories of retribution, of camps, of humiliation designed not merely to punish but to remind the defeated of their place in a reordered world. These stories had been useful once. They had strengthened resolve, sharpened fear into obedience. Now they replayed in her mind without purpose, a catalogue of imagined futures that felt both inevitable and unreal. When the British finally appeared in her immediate reality, they did not match the images she had carried for so long. There was no theatrical entrance, no declaration meant to impress or terrify. Their presence was defined by movement and organization rather than spectacle. Vehicles rolled forward methodically. Commands were issued in controlled tones. The scene lacked drama, and that absence itself was disorienting. Victory, she realized, did not always announce itself loudly. She waited for the moment when attention would turn toward her, when judgment would be delivered in whatever form it took. Her body responded before her thoughts did, tightening, preparing for impact that never came. Instead, she was processed, counted, directed, recorded, as if she were part of an inventory rather than a symbol. This, too, was unexpected. To be treated as a logistical reality rather than an ideological one unsettled her deeply. Internally, she retreated. Years of discipline had taught her how to disappear while remaining physically present. She avoided eye contact. She followed instructions precisely. She made herself small not in stature, but in intention, hoping that compliance might render her unremarkable. Defeat, she believed, demanded erasure. Anything else felt dangerous. The landscape around her bore the marks of recent violence, yet life persisted stubbornly within it. Civilians moved cautiously, unsure which rules still applied. Children appeared briefly and vanished again, as if testing whether normality was safe. The contrast between the enormity of what had ended and the ordinariness of what continued created a quiet tension that hung in the air. The war was over, but its presence lingered in every gesture, every pause. She felt a growing awareness of being suspended between identities. She was no longer what she had been during the war, yet nothing had replaced that role. The future was undefined, and the past pressed heavily against her thoughts, no longer held at bay by urgency. Memories surfaced uninvited, moments of certainty, moments of fear, moments she had once dismissed as necessary. Now, stripped of context, they demanded attention. What she feared most was not punishment alone, but judgment, the possibility that everything she had endured, everything she had believed herself to be, would be reduced to a single verdict imposed by others. In this sense, being ignored seemed preferable. To be overlooked was to remain ambiguous, unclassified, unfinished. Acknowledgement threatened finality. And yet, beneath the fear, there was another emotion she struggled to name. It was not relief, exactly, but a loosening of something tightly wound within her. The constant anticipation of catastrophe had shaped her for so long that its absence felt unnatural. She did not trust it. Calm, in this context, seemed like a trap. As night approached, the sounds around her softened. Orders became fewer. Movement slowed. She lay awake, aware of every sensation, every unfamiliar noise. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams that blended past and present without distinction. Even rest felt provisional, something that could be revoked at any moment. In the darkness, she confronted a thought she had avoided since the first signs of collapse, that the war had not only ended outside her, but within her as well. The certainty that had once justified endurance was gone, replaced by a fragile awareness of individual consequence. For the first time, she understood that survival would no longer be measured by loyalty or obedience, but by adaptation to a moral landscape she had never been prepared to navigate. She had expected defeat to erase her. Instead, it left her painfully present, forced to exist without the protective weight of ideology. This was the beginning she had not anticipated, a beginning shaped not by violence, but by uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, she waited, braced for neglect, convinced that invisibility would be her only mercy in a world that had moved decisively beyond her. British custody did not announce itself as a turning point. It arrived without spectacle, without the emotional punctuation she had prepared for. She had expected sharp commands, a visible assertion of dominance, perhaps even cruelty disguised as necessity. Instead, the transition into captivity unfolded with an almost disconcerting calm. The structures were clear, the rules firm, yet the atmosphere lacked the hostility she had braced herself against. This absence did not feel comforting at first. It felt wrong, as though something essential had been omitted. The first realization came quietly. No one was shouting at her. Instructions were given evenly, repeated when necessary, enforced without humiliation. She noticed this not because it was dramatic, but because it contradicted everything she had been taught to expect. Her body remained tense, her mind alert for a delayed reaction, certain that restraint was merely the prelude to something harsher. She had learned that power revealed itself through intimidation. Here, power seemed to operate differently. British soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, but without the performative aggression she associated with authority. Their confidence appeared internal, not dependent on fear. They did not need to prove victory, it was already established. This distinction unsettled her more than open hostility would have. Without an enemy's rage to respond to, she was left alone with her assumptions, each one gradually exposed as unreliable. The routines of custody were methodical. Names were taken, conditions assessed, movements controlled. Yet within this system, There was an unexpected precision that bordered on care. Medical checks were conducted not as interrogations, but as procedures. Wounds were examined with clinical detachment, not judgment. Hunger was addressed with rationed regularity. These acts were small, almost invisible within the larger machinery of occupation, but their cumulative effect was destabilizing. They suggested a logic not rooted in vengeance. She struggled to reconcile this experience with the image of the enemy she had carried for years. That image had been essential to survival during the war. It had simplified moral boundaries, transforming uncertainty into clarity. Now, confronted with behavior that refused to fit the narrative, she felt a growing sense of cognitive dissonance. If the enemy did not behave as expected, what did that say about the certainty she had relied upon? There was no celebration in their demeanor, no visible satisfaction in overseeing the defeated. This absence of triumph confused her deeply. Victory, she had believed, demanded acknowledgement, some outward sign that one side had prevailed. Instead, the British approach treated defeat as a condition to be managed rather than exploited. She could not decide whether this was more merciful or more frightening. Her instinct was to remain guarded. Kindness, she believed, was often conditional, a tool employed strategically. She waited for the moment when expectations would shift, when patience would expire. Each passing hour without incident felt like borrowed time. She replayed interactions repeatedly in her mind, searching for hidden meanings, for signs of manipulation she might have missed. The environment reinforced this ambiguity. Facilities were sparse but functional. There was no effort to degrade her surroundings beyond necessity. Even the physical spaces reflected restraint, clean enough to be tolerable, orderly enough to discourage chaos. She noticed that the guards followed rules as strictly as the prisoners did. This symmetry suggested a system governed by principles rather than impulse. What disturbed her most was the way this treatment forced her into awareness of herself as an individual. During the war, individuality had been submerged beneath collective identity. Now, stripped of that framework, she felt exposed. To be seen not as a representative of a cause but as a single person was unexpectedly vulnerable. It removed the armor she had worn unconsciously for years. She observed others in custody, noting similar reactions mirrored in their faces. Some responded with suspicion, others with quiet relief they tried desperately to conceal. No one spoke openly about it. There was an unspoken agreement that acknowledging humane treatment felt dangerous, as though gratitude itself might be interpreted as betrayal, either of the past or of one's own defenses. Days passed without the anticipated escalation. Interrogations, when they occurred, were structured, limited in scope, focused on information rather than confession. There was no theatrical pressure, no attempts to provoke emotional collapse. This approach was almost more difficult to endure than brutality would have been. Without pain to justify resistance, she was left confronting the ethical weight of cooperation. She began to notice subtle details that challenged her internal narrative. A guard offering water without comment. A medic adjusting a bandage with practiced care. A moment of patience extended when confusion slowed compliance. None of these actions were extraordinary in isolation, yet together they formed a pattern that contradicted the image of an enemy driven by hatred. This pattern forced an uncomfortable introspection. She had been taught that cruelty from the other side was inevitable, even righteous. That belief had justified endurance, sacrifice, and silence. Now, confronted with restraint instead of cruelty, she was compelled to reconsider not only the enemy, but the system that had insisted such behavior was impossible. She resisted this reconsideration instinctively. To question those beliefs felt like a threat to her own coherence. If she accepted that the enemy was capable of decency, what did that imply about the absolutes she had lived by? The question lingered, unresolved, pressing against the edges of her thoughts. At night, she lay awake replaying small interactions that now seemed outsized in significance. A neutral tone. A lack of insult. The simple fact of being addressed rather than dismissed. These moments refused to fade, their ordinariness transforming into something unsettling. They suggested that moral complexity had survived the war, intact and operational even after so much destruction. She had expected British custody to confirm everything she feared. Instead, it destabilized her emotional defenses. Without cruelty to rally against, she felt disarmed. This vulnerability manifested not as openness, but as heightened alertness. She watched constantly, waiting for the inevitable reversal that would restore familiar patterns. But that reversal did not come. And in its absence, a subtle shift began within her. It was not trust, far from it, but recognition. Recognition that power could be exercised without humiliation. That authority could exist without spectacle. That victory did not require the erasure of the defeated. This realization did not bring comfort. It brought confusion. It complicated the moral simplicity that had sustained her through years of hardship. It suggested that the world was less binary than she had been taught, that right and wrong did not align neatly with uniforms and flags. By treating her with measured restraint, British custody forced her into a space of moral uncertainty she had never been trained to occupy. It was easier to endure suffering than ambiguity. Suffering had purpose. Ambiguity demanded reflection. She began to understand that this phase of defeat was not about punishment, but about transition. The war had ended, but its moral consequences were still unfolding, reshaping identities in quiet, irreversible ways. She was no longer merely waiting for judgment. She was being confronted with the unsettling possibility that the enemy she had feared might not validate the hatred she had been taught to carry. And in that realization, something shifted. Not dramatically, not consciously, but persistently. The certainty that had once anchored her began to erode, replaced by questions she could no longer dismiss. British custody, in its restraint, had done something violence never could. It forced her to confront the limits of the beliefs that had once defined her world. The care began to emerge in the most unexpected of ways, small gestures that slowly unraveled her understanding of what it meant to be both a prisoner and a person. Medical attention, once a formality designed to prolong suffering or extract information, became an act of neutral professionalism. She was examined with no hint of judgment, her wounds treated with a distance that left her feeling more confused than reassured. The soldiers did not look at her with suspicion, nor did they linger over her injuries with exaggerated sympathy. Their eyes seemed not to see her as a symbol of the enemy, but as an individual who had suffered. Their manner, businesslike and efficient, stripped the act of medical attention of the theatrics she had come to expect. There was no point to it, she realized, except the act itself. And that was far more unsettling than cruelty could have been. The meals, too, were not meant to make her feel grateful, nor were they tainted by the kind of calculated deprivation she had braced for. The rations were simple, but consistent. They did not come with the reminder that she had lost something in defeat, something she could never reclaim. The food was sustenance. It arrived as something that all human beings needed, not as a reward or a punishment. She had been used to the idea that only the deserving were given the right to eat, the idea that hunger was a consequence of war, that it was a condition not just of the body, but of morality. Here, in this camp, there was no such reckoning. The hungry were fed because it was practical, because it was what any system required to maintain itself. Her stomach did not twist with shame after each meal. She simply ate, and for a moment, the guilt that had long clouded her ability to enjoy even the most basic of comforts was momentarily muted. Sleep was another arena where care revealed itself. She had expected restless nights, sleep interrupted by nightmares or the threat of violence. Instead, she was granted a quiet space, dimly lit, furnished only with the basics: a cot, a blanket, a pillow. The absence of threat in the environment created a strange paradox. Her body, trained for so long to expect discomfort, was now free to relax, yet it didn't. Her muscles, stiff from long periods of vigilance, resisted the idea of calm. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning, unwilling to accept that this was no longer war. That this was no longer survival at the edges, but something else entirely, a time and space she had never been prepared for. The simplicity of the care was also part of its dissonance. She had expected cruelty to come with all of life's details. She had expected no mercy in the mundane, no grace in the quiet moments of the day. But here, it was the mundane that had changed. The basic functions of human life, eating, sleeping, receiving medical attention, had been reclaimed from the realm of punishment and transformed into acts of human decency, not for her benefit, but for the sake of necessity. This wasn't mercy. It wasn't kindness, either. It was simply the way things were done when one operated outside of animosity, when the animating force was not revenge, but the mechanics of governance. And so, in this new reality, she found herself alone with a growing confusion. How could something so simple, so ordinary, become so jarring? She thought back to the days before her capture, to the certainties of war, to the clarity of side and enemy. Then cruelty made sense. It was the punctuation that marked the end of a fight, the confirmation of one side's supremacy over the other. But here, there was no such punctuation. There was no grand statement of victory, no triumphant declaration that they had bested her. Instead, there was a quiet, persistent care that she had not expected, and it stripped her of the foundation she had relied upon. Every interaction, every simple exchange, carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. The moment when a soldier handed her a cup of water, there was nothing remarkable about it, and yet it resonated in ways she could not articulate. There was no spite in his action, no judgment in the way his eyes flickered over her. His hands, rough and calloused, offered the same drink they would offer any other prisoner or soldier. There was no difference in the way she was treated, nothing that distinguished her from the others except the knowledge that she was on the losing side of history. The water was not a favor nor a reward. It was simply the act of one human being offering another something necessary for survival. In the days that followed, she grew more attuned to the way that this form of care worked. It wasn't consistent with the way she had been raised to understand power. She had been taught that strength was exercised through force, through control, through domination. But here, in the absence of any display of these elements, she found herself confronted with something more unsettling. Power that didn't need to announce itself. Power that moved through the background, through the ordinary gestures of life. And with this realization came another uncomfortable truth. Perhaps there was no morality in the application of force. Perhaps it was not about the means by which one achieved power, but the way in which one chose to wield it once it was attained. This possibility gnawed at her, especially as time passed and the days bled into one another, indistinguishable except for the rhythms of prison life that began to take on a strange familiarity. In the absence of punishment, her sense of self began to shift. She had once seen herself as a representative of a cause, as an embodiment of the ideals for which she had fought. But here, in this moment, that identity felt hollow. She was not the embodiment of a cause. She was a human being receiving care, no different from anyone else in the camp. The systems that had supported her before had collapsed, and now, without the framework of ideology to hold her up, she was simply one person among many. She had no unique value, no special significance. She was no longer a soldier. She was just someone waiting, uncertain of what would happen next. She felt small in this new world, her past identity crumbling in the face of this new reality. And in this smallness, she found herself contemplating what it meant to be treated as an individual, as a person who mattered not because of her allegiances or her role, but because she was a human being in need of care. This, too, was unsettling. She had been raised to believe that loyalty and sacrifice were the only true measures of worth. But here, in the quiet of her captivity, she was faced with the uncomfortable possibility that her worth was not determined by what she had given, but simply by what she was, a living, breathing person whose needs, in this moment, had nothing to do with the war. And yet, in this realization, something else began to stir. Beneath the confusion, there was the faintest whisper of relief. Not relief in the sense of escaping punishment, but relief in the understanding that perhaps there was another way to exist, one not defined by allegiance or cause. Perhaps there was a life beyond the battle lines, beyond the fight for supremacy, beyond the need to prove oneself through force. But this thought, too, was elusive. It remained out of reach, like a shadow on the edge of her awareness, fading whenever she tried to grasp it. As she lay in her cot that night, staring into the darkness, She realized that the care she had been receiving, though it was not designed to elicit gratitude, had forced her into a new kind of reckoning. It was not the reckoning she had expected, the one where punishment and consequence reigned. It was not a reckoning with the enemy. It was a reckoning with herself, with her own assumptions about strength, loyalty, and the nature of power. And that was the most uncomfortable truth of all. That here, in the quiet simplicity of captivity, she was being forced to confront the limits of what she had believed to be true. And in doing so, she found herself confronting the very nature of humanity itself. As the days wore on, the imbalance between expectation and reality deepened, growing more pronounced with each passing moment. She had entered this phase of her captivity expecting to be treated as a defeated foe, perhaps with some degree of calculation, perhaps with the sharp edge of bitterness, but nothing had prepared her for what she found instead. The absence of cruelty in the British approach forced her to confront an unnerving truth, the simple truth that power need not be expressed through domination. Here, it existed in restraint, in patience, in an almost mechanical maintenance of order that bore no trace of malice, no hint of vindictiveness. Every gesture, every interaction, every moment spent in their care seemed to suggest that their superiority did not require reaffirmation through humiliation. It was a revelation she had never anticipated. The British had not come for vengeance, nor did they seek to impose themselves upon her with the weight of triumph. Instead, they had come with something far more unsettling, a methodical system of order that regarded her as one of many, no more important or less important than the others who found themselves captured. She could not escape the feeling that this approach, though technically devoid of hostility, bore a subtle, almost insidious cruelty of its own. It was a cruelty that had no sharp edges, no clear markers of pain. It worked beneath the surface, a slow, creeping dissolution of the certainty she had once carried about herself and the world around her. She was not ignorant of the strategic underpinnings of this approach. There was no great mystery in the decision to treat prisoners with a sense of neutral fairness. She could see that it was far more effective than any overt display of power. After all, what was more effective in asserting control than leaving someone unmoored, uncertain of where they stood? When there was no obvious torment, no clear sign of punishment, it forced her to reckon with the notion that this treatment might not be simply the result of some charitable decision on the part of her captors. It might be deliberate. She might not be offered this care for her comfort. She was merely another cog in a machine designed to maintain order, and her role in it was simply to remain manageable, to stay quiet and compliant until the inevitable shift in global power made her situation unimportant. But the more she dwelled on this, the more the subtlety of the situation gnawed at her. The idea that she was not a target of hate, but simply another task to manage, should have been easier to bear than the alternative. Yet it was precisely this detachment that filled her with anxiety. She had lived for so long with the certainty of being hated, of being the other, the enemy, whose very existence was framed in opposition to the victors. But now, to exist without hate, without being identified as the enemy, felt somehow like a disservice to her own existence. If she was not hated, then what was she? What did her life mean without that narrative of conflict? She found herself in a disorienting space between two conflicting realities. On the one hand, there was the reality of her captivity, which had shifted from one of expected cruelty to a neutral, almost antiseptic routine. On the other hand, there was the reality of her own internal war, the one that raged inside her every time she was handed food or water without judgment, every time a guard regarded her with a disinterested air that made her feel less than human. She had expected to be despised. Anything less, she thought, would strip away the purpose of her identity. She could not fathom an existence where hatred was absent, where every act of survival was not driven by some sort of resentment or justified animosity. This absence of hate left her vulnerable in ways she hadn't anticipated. She began to recognize how much of her identity had been shaped by animosity. She had fought not just for her country, but against something, against an ideology that had told her that there were enemies out there, enemies whose very existence threatened the life she knew. In the absence of these enemies, she was faced with an unfamiliar question. Who was she if she wasn't defined by the struggle? Without the war to frame her existence, She felt herself slipping into a void, one where purpose was as elusive as the hostility she had expected to meet at every turn. The more she lived with the British approach, the more she came to understand how deeply her sense of self had been tied to the context of war. The violence, the fear, the rage, they had all served a purpose in giving her a role to play. But now, in the face of an order that was almost disturbingly devoid of emotion, she began to wonder whether she had ever truly known herself outside of that context. The British cared for her not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, but simply as a person, another individual caught up in a much larger system, one beyond her control or comprehension. This new way of being, where identity was no longer framed by the righteousness of a cause, was not a simple reorientation of the mind. It was a confrontation with the very fabric of her beliefs. To be treated without contempt, without disdain, was not a relief. It was an assault on everything she had known. Her former understanding of the world had relied on binaries, right and wrong, us and them, conqueror and conquered. But in this new world, there were no obvious enemies, no one to despise. There was simply the cold, methodical continuation of life, a continuation that didn't need her to participate in the drama of conflict. She was merely part of a bigger picture, a cog in a system where her past actions mattered less than her present compliance. The British, she realized, had no use for her resentment. They did not need her to carry the weight of history on her shoulders, to wear the mantle of guilt and shame as a reminder of their victory. It was she who carried that weight, not them. They had moved past it. And in doing so, they stripped her of her most enduring narrative, that of a soldier in a righteous war. Without that, she was left with the quiet terror of who she might be now, a person who had no cause to fight for, no clear path forward. Her mind began to spiral in ever-tightening circles. If she was not an enemy, then who was she? What was left of her identity if not the reflection of the war she had fought, the belief she had carried, the justification she had always clung to? She had been one part of a larger machine, but now that machine had crumbled, and she was left, not with relief, but with the painful awareness of how little she truly understood herself outside of that context. The British soldiers who cared for her with such calculated disinterest had unknowingly forced her into a crisis of self. Their lack of judgment, their absence of contempt, highlighted the harsh reality of the war's end, that life, in all its complexity, could continue without the frame of ideology. Without the hatred, without the certainty of conflict, there was only existence, a constant, ever-changing flow of moments that made no claim to the past. And it was in this new reality, this existence without the comforting weight of hate or victory, that she found herself lost. Every day she spent in the camp without any overt confrontation, without any new sign of punishment or reproach, deepened this feeling. It was not peace that she found, but a cold dislocation from the very foundation of her being. The British did not need to break her, they simply let her exist without the scaffolding of her former beliefs. In that act of apparent neutrality, they had done something far more profound. They had stripped her of the war she had always known, leaving her to stand on the edge of something unfamiliar and, for the first time, truly unknown. With each passing day, the subtle weight of the British approach began to shift something fundamental within her. It was a shift she did not welcome, nor did she understand it at first. At times, it felt as though she were losing herself, that the very core of who she had been was being worn away by the passing of time in captivity, by the absence of war and hatred, by the realization that the very values she had once held dear were no longer relevant. In the beginning, she had held on to the idea that survival was an active rebellion against defeat. But now, the longer she remained in the British camp, the clearer it became that survival, in its most honest form, was not about resistance or even acceptance of her condition. It was about something entirely different. It was about understanding that she no longer had to define herself by the violence of the past. That revelation, though small, unsettled her deeply. The British, in their care and neutrality, had unwittingly removed the foundation upon which her entire identity had been built. Before, she had been defined by the war, by her role within it, by the moral framework that divided the world into friends and enemies, victors and vanquished. Her existence had been a response to that division. Everything she did, every choice she made, had been filtered through that lens. But now, in this strange limbo of captivity, all of that seemed meaningless. The rules of the war had evaporated, and with them, the rules by which she had lived. It was a horrifying realization, not one that offered solace, but rather left her adrift in an emotional vacuum. At first, this vacuum was difficult to bear. She felt a deep longing for the certainty she had known, for the clear demarcations between right and wrong, good and evil. The past, with all its violence and moral absolutism, seemed safer than this cold, indifferent present. But as time wore on, as she continued to live within the confines of the camp, she began to see that her resistance to this new reality was doing more harm than good. The very things that had kept her going during the war, the firm belief in the righteousness of her cause, the sense of clarity about who was right and who was wrong, were now leading her down a path of despair. For the first time in her life, she was forced to confront the unsettling possibility that there was no longer any grand, overarching story to tell. There was no longer any certainty to cling to. There was only this moment, and that was terrifying. Yet in this very terror, something was slowly changing within her. The realization that the British did not need her to carry the weight of hatred, that their care was offered without judgment, without any kind of moral judgment or expectation, started to shift her perspective. At first, she had resented it. How could they offer her care without any understanding of the pain and suffering that she had endured? How could they not acknowledge the history that had brought her to this point? It felt like an erasure, a denial of the very struggle she had fought for. But as the days passed, she began to see it differently. Their care, in its neutrality, was not an act of kindness, nor was it an act of cruelty. It simply was. It was as though they had stripped away the need for retribution, the need for justification, and had reduced the relationship between them to its most basic elements. They were not offering mercy, because they did not see her as someone in need of mercy. They saw her only as another human being. And that realization was both a relief and a burden. In time, she found herself reflecting on the nature of power, and how it had always been defined by conflict, by domination, by the act of imposing one's will on others. But now, she saw power expressed differently. It was expressed in restraint, in the quiet management of a situation without the need for overt force. The British had done nothing to humiliate her, to force her into submission. They had simply accepted her as a part of the larger machinery that continued to function, regardless of the animosity that had preceded it. This, she realized, was true power. Power that did not need to be justified, power that did not need to be expressed in violence or hatred. Power that existed simply because it was there, and because it was necessary for the continuation of a larger order. And yet, even as she came to understand this, she could not fully accept it. There was something unsettling about this new kind of power, something that felt like an existential threat to her very identity. Without the war, without the hatred, without the struggle, who was she? She had no answer to that question. The idea that she might have to live without the clarity of war, without the certainty of who was on which side, without the ability to define herself in opposition to something else, this idea filled her with unease. The more she thought about it, the more she felt herself slipping away, as though she were being erased by the very care that had been offered to her. It was a terrifying feeling, the sensation of losing oneself in the absence of everything that had once defined existence.